But for the moment, let's move on to the other kinds of minds problem. So this is different than the old philosophical and very philosophical problem of other minds. I mean, some people, when they ask me what philosophers do, if I were to give them the problem of other minds as a paradigm case of what philosophers do, the reaction I tend to get is that people just shake their heads and kind of roll their eyes and go, right, well, I guess I was always right about the idiocy of philosophy. And so I don't usually use that as the paradigm case of what philosophers do, because I don't really think it's a good example of the most interesting thing, at least from most people's perspective, that philosophers do. It's a serious problem, theoretically, of course, but it's not one that really has traction on most people's minds. Maybe we're all just a bit like Dennett, and we just take the intentional stance towards each other, and we don't really have a problem believing that other people have mental states, even if we realize that there is this justificatory problem in the background. But the other kinds of minds problem is something that crops up quite poignantly in research on animal minds. So here, we're also wondering whether certain entities have mental states, like phenomenal states, or maybe beliefs, desires. I don't have the quote here, but of course there was a quote that some of you might be familiar with from Descartes, where he thinks that, you know, animals are just like clocks, right? And so, you know, there's no problem in like kicking the dog out of your way or beating your horse as it's getting lazy pulling your cart or something, because they cry out as if they're in pain, but really they're just mechanisms and they don't really feel pain at all. Of course, no one really believes that anymore, and we think that Descartes was barbaric to think such a thing. But there's still a problem about how and when we attribute minds to other non-human animals, and then what kinds of minds we attribute to them. It's like it's an all or nothing thing, like either they don't have minds like Descartes thought, or they have minds that are exactly like ours. So what do we say about creatures or beings that don't or can't report their own mental states to us? And at least we can verify in some sense from each other, well, okay, so I see you're wincing and crying out because somebody gave you an injection there. Why is that? And then they'll tell you something about their phenomenal state, and they may also report various beliefs and desires that they're in. But we can't do the same thing with parrots or octopuses or anything like that. So one thing that actually happens in this kind of research is that you end up getting a kind of argument from analogy like the one we looked at before. And so you'll take the evidence that we have for human mentality or consciousness, as they're calling it here, as some kind of reference or benchmark. And so you'll see that people report being in a certain kind of mental state in some wide variety maybe of experimental paradigms or situations. And then you consider those reports, you correlate them with other kinds of evidence like neuroscientific evidence, maybe anatomical evidence of other kinds, and so on. And you find that there's a nice tight correlation between certain kinds of information you can get like that and people's self-reports. And then you might think that even in the absence of reports like that, whenever people, I mean, leaving aside the theoretical issues about identity theory and so on, the identity theorist nevertheless starts out from noticing these correlations, and then the move is to try and explain those correlations, perhaps in terms of a common cause or instead in terms of identity or something. But here, I mean, we'll at least say, well, look, surely we'd be warranted in attributing the same sorts of mental states to creatures, even in the absence of a report, if they're in the same sorts of functional states or even your physiological states and so on. So you'll notice all of these things and then see if there's something that works similarly in a creature you're looking at, in which case you might infer that that creature, at least potentially, has mental states that are somewhat similar to the states we have when we're in certain physical states. Okay, so this is actually what gets done quite a bit. Now, it works well in some cases, but in other cases, not so well. So we can look at octopuses and other cephalopods like that, and we'll notice that they have certain behavior, like object discrimination, and we can look at other kinds of behavior, like at least some evidence for observational learning, memory capacities, etc. And then we look at their anatomy, and we see that they have some similarities to other creatures when it comes to the sensory receptors, nervous systems they have, etc. And then we'll try and make a similar move. In the case of octopuses, as it's noted in the little quotation I have here at the bottom, it's easier to do this, at least so far, for certain creatures like birds, and attribute mental states to them on this kind of argument from an analogy basis than it is for octopuses, just because, as it says here, their neuroanatomy is currently insufficiently characterized to really give some very rich or advanced argument of this sort, to say that they have functionally analogous structures to the structures that we have, that we attribute mental states on the basis of, maybe in the absence of report, or that we might be able to do something similar for with birds. So we're just not in a great position to take this strategy when it comes to certain creatures. Okay. Relatedly, you might think, well, we should think about things, and a lot of the work on animal cognition actually focuses on this, on whether creatures have the capacity to do what philosophers and cognitive scientists call mind reading. That's not some magical ability. It's just the ability to interpret another conspecifics, so another member of your own species, behavior in useful ways, perhaps to do something like Dennett calls taking the intentional stance, using folk psychology, and attribute mental states to another creature of your own species at least, in order to explain and predict its behavior. That's all mind reading means, roughly speaking, in this context. So not every human does this, in fact, because humans below the age of 4 tend not to do it, right? Humans below the age of 4 don't think that other humans have mental states that are distinct from their own mental states. Okay, you might not remember this. Anybody remember when they were 2? I don't remember anything from when I was 2. Okay, so the false belief task is something that's used to test for this in children, the Sally-Ann test, as it was originally called. I'm not sure if you can read the text on this, but it was a simple test. Children are given this little story. These two people, Sally and Anne. Sally has a basket, Anne has a box. Sally also has a marble, and she puts the marble into her basket, okay? And then Sally goes out for a walk. Anne takes the marble out of the basket and puts it into the box, okay? And then stands there as if she didn't do anything, okay? And then Sally comes back, and she's looking for her marble. She wants to play with it. And the question that you ask the child is, where will Sally look for the marble? Now, we all, of course, will say, well, what will we say? What will you say? She'll look for it in the basket. I mean, she left it there. First place, presumably, she's going to look for it. But children under the age of 4 say that Sally will look for it in the box. Right? Why? Well, because they saw Anne putting it in the box, and they know it's in the box. And so the fact that they think that Sally would automatically know that it's in the box seems to fail to attribute a false belief to Sally. And so the children seem to be just assuming that these other people in the story, Sally and Anne, have the same access to information as the child themselves does, and that they don't have mental states that are distinct. Once they reach about the age of 4, they suddenly switch over and they immediately give the answer that we all give. And so a lot of the work in animal cognition now is on trying to test whether animals can do something similar to this. And so if they can, then it seems like they are doing something like mind reading. They are taking something like the intentional stance towards each other. They do have a sort of folk psychology of their own, and they're attributing mental states to each other. So, I mean, that's kind of switching the question around from whether we would attribute mental states to the creatures to first looking at whether they attribute mental states to each other. And one way you might do this is by having tests like this that you can give the animals. Obviously, you're not going to tell them a little story like this, but you can construct similar experimental paradigms. Okay, one problem with the idea of thinking that animals, non-human animals, have beliefs is that we saw from last week that propositional attitudes like beliefs, a belief is a kind of an attitude that we have towards a proposition. We believe that X is to take a certain sort of attitude towards the propositional content X. So there's intentional content in adopting a propositional attitude towards some proposition. So basically, as we saw last week, these attitudes represent an actual or possible state of affairs, and they're capable of being true or false. So it seems like if we bring in semantic evaluability like that, truth or falsity, they have to be somewhat linguistic in structure. And so when we imagine the dog looking here and thinking, that's a cat, we're sort of, it's supposed to be analogous to what we would have. It's adopting a certain attitude like belief towards propositional content that can be assessed for truth or falsity. If it was a possum or something there, and the dog is thinking that's a cat, then we know that it's false. That intentional content is false. But here we might say, well, it's true. The dog has a true belief. But if we have to have propositional content like that, you might think, well, we have to have language. And do we think the dog has language? Now it becomes less clear. Especially if the content gets more specific and they think, oh, that's the neighbor's new kitten. Okay? Now there's a lot more going on for the dog, potentially. And of course, the cat just might think something like this, as they presumably do. That's just one of those really annoying creatures, again. Okay, so this argument is supposed to go something like this. And I'm reconstructing this from an argument from Stephen Stitch in Kristen Andrews' article on animal cognition in the Stanford Encyclopedia. So you might think that intentionality, propositional attitudes require concept possession and language, as I've just suggested. So in order to have, for something to have a belief, it would have to have a concept. In order to have a concept that could be expressed in language, you have to have particular kinds of knowledge, including how the concept relates to other concepts. Non-human animals don't have such knowledge, so they don't have concepts and language like that. So non-human animals don't have beliefs. Okay? So that's the sort of argument that somebody can make against the idea that animals, non-human animals have beliefs. Now, there's evidence, oh my God, the time, how do we get here? Let me just go through this really quickly. There's evidence that this idea may be false. There's various evidence to show that, for example, the alarm cries of vervet monkeys, they seem to be able to do specific things, like they'll make a certain sort of call, a leopard call, and the monkeys are supposed to look in the trees. They'll make a snake call, and the other monkeys will look on the ground, etc. And that seems to be conveying some sort of information. So it's not as clear that these creatures don't use concepts or have something analogous to linguistic behavior. Similar things go for things like crows. They seem to engage in various kinds of behavior that seems to indicate that they do have concepts. So you can look at this slide afterwards. I just have to jump over it very quickly now. Now, just to wrap up, Kristen Andrews takes this challenge, she calls Morgan's challenge, that we should interpret animal behavior just in the most basic terms we need to explain it. And she also suggests we should do the same for human behavior. And if we can explain behavior even without appeal to language or concepts, then that's what we should do in the case of animals. And by the same token, in fact, she thinks that we might be best advised to do something similar in the case of humans too. And maybe this emphasis on concepts that can be expressed linguistically and so on in a very sophisticated way is not actually what it is that we're doing most basically when we're predicting and explaining each other's behavior. Maybe we use various different kinds of methods to do it, and maybe we build prescriptive models. So models that generate expectations, let's say, about people's behavior. Now, I'll just have to skip over this last part. I mean, I wasn't going to spend much time on it in any case, but it links to this really amazing work, which is great to read. If you ever get a chance to read this book, Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are, by Frans de Waal, it's really a great read. It was on the New York Times bestseller list, so it's not a terribly difficult to read either, but it's very interesting. But you might do similar moves to what Andrew's just suggested on the last slide there, when it comes to explaining agency and normativity and so on. But for the moment, that's it. Thanks for choosing the unit. Good luck with the exam. If any of you are interested in doing honours in philosophy, you should contact the honours coordinator. The exam will be coming up obviously soon. Fun times. Enjoy that. Otherwise, we'll see you. Thanks.